Afternoon all. I'd like to show you another key game from the Evolution of Style series, and I think it's key because it's Mikhail Botvinnik playing against one of his great predecessors for one of the last times, Alexander Alekhine. So this is in the AVRO tournament of 1938, just before World War II. Unfortunately, after World War II, Alexander Alekhine, who was scheduled to play Mikhail Botvinnik, was found dead in his hotel room. Apparently swallowed, maybe speculation that he'd swallowed too much of a steak or something. He'd died of a heart attack as a result of that. So these two games they played in AVRO 1938 represent the last two games, but I want to show you one of the decisive encounters there. So Mikhail Botvinnik playing white played knight f3, and Alekhine responded d5. We see d4, knight f6, c4, e6. So queen's gambit declined at the moment. Knight c3, and the usual move here, the most popular overall, is c6 actually in my live book, or bishop e7 is very, very popular. But we see c5, kind of semi-Tarrasch. Now we see c takes d5, but black doesn't go for e takes d5 here, but instead plays knight takes d5, and white technically has a potentially vulnerable pawn on d4, and plays e3. Okay, so we're going to end up potentially with an isolated queen's pawn situation. Knight c6, bishop c4. Slightly more popular here is actually bishop d3. So bishop c4, c takes, e takes, bishop e7. It looks absolutely fairly standard, this isolated queen's pawn scenario. So the isolated queen's pawns are a very important class of chess positions for anyone to study for their own chess development, because they can arise from a multitude of different opening systems. So it's interesting to see theoretically how these world champions play against each other here from this position. Both sides now castle, and the most popular move here is actually played, which is rook e1. Bishop d3 is second most popular, but rook e1 just slightly more popular. Rook e1, 283 games rather. And here, now this is critical, and I want to make an important comment here. Well, about what I think is an important comment, that it might not be necessarily the case, in my opinion, that Botvinnik was any more fundamentally brilliant in the middle game and end games than Alexander Alekhine. What does concretely improve through chess history is actually the evolution of chess opening theory. It's very, very important, the stronger your opponent is, not to give any sort of handicap, any disadvantage from the opening. And unfortunately, I have to say that this next move, unfortunately, does give a slight handicap to black. It looks like a fairly standard isolated queen's pawn position here. In my live book, though, black has a very careful move available, but it still might be, a slight advantage to white. There's two very careful moves. This might look a little bit silly, but knight f6 actually is the most popular move here, just to retreat the knight back. It's kind of done its job to make sure the pawn was left on e6, and we have again a classic isolated queen's pawn, but black can more carefully arrange a blockade under more ideal circumstances. This is not too terrible. It's known to be a slight advantage for white, and the game could continue. For example, black might actually be considering, after this retreat, I know it looks a little bit paradoxical, but black might actually be playing things like b6 and bishop b7, and then later knight b4 to d5. The d5 is a good blockade, and the diagonal might also be quite useful for black. And the problem here is, though, as well, bishop f6 is also another popular move from this position, and play might continue. Knight e4, and either b6 or the bishop going back. Bishop going back It's kind of done its job because there's no pressure on there's less pressure on d5. Any bishop d5, you know, there's even queen d5 potentially. So this position, you know, is okay as well. Just, it seems silly to do this, but there's finesses at great stake here and of great significance. You may not believe this because it looks like such a standard looking position, but this next move, b6, is not quite, it doesn't seem quite right here. White does play a forcing move, which, okay, paradoxically gets rid of black's isolated, gets rid of, pardon me, the dynamism which the isolated queen's pawn can afford, but it protects the d pawn frontally. So the d pawn, after this next move, knight takes d5, white is maintaining the aggressive light square bishop. But if you look at the situation now, the frontal pressure has gone from the isolated queen's pawn. And white has another forcing move available now, bishop b5. From an engine point of view, this is already a slight advantage to white, believe it or not. It's as if black has got a slight handicap from the opening. And unfortunately, again, Alexander Alekhine exacerbates that a little bit with his next move. Possibly best here is bishop b7. If we had bishop b7, white would still be slightly better. There's a little bit of uncomfortable pressure. So, you know, white hasn't really got the issue of d4 frontally. The downside of the isolated queen's pawn being removed, and white's also looking forward to just simple, you know, pressure on the queen side against either the light squares or the c file. So the white is slightly better, but what happened in the game is not so good, I think, as bishop d7. Technically now, white's advantage is almost approaching a pawn. It's a very clear advantage. It's not a pleasant position here for black after this next move, queen a4. And I would argue it's not really because, you know, Alekhine might not be an inferior player in the middle game and endgame, but opening theory relentlessly evolves. You know, Mikhail Botvinnik, the father of Soviet chess, had great students under him. Karpov, Kasparov, Shirov, Kramnik. You know, this is the father of Soviet Union chess, Mikhail Botvinnik. And he's getting here a significant advantage against Alexander Alekhine. Alekhine is struggling here in this position. If he plays a routine move like rook c8, that might be best. And you might think, well, what about this pawn? I don't think this is at all harmful to try and win a pawn here. In this position, actually, the queen's going to be trapped, so that's not really a problem at all. This position, you know, black will be slightly better if it has to sacrifice the queen for two pieces. That's not a problem. So rook c8, but even so, white has a pleasant position here with a move like bishop f4. But this might have been the way to go, rook c8. But instead, we see knight b8 now. So things are getting slightly more uncomfortable than before, because now after bishop f4, this c file is simply just, it's a real pain that the rook is simply coordinating with the bishop. That c7 square is a very valuable entry point here for white. This small advantage is a small nagging advantage, difficult to shake off. So what did Alekhine do now? He took on b5 and he tried to play resourcefully. a6 is quite a clever move, as we'll see, because it actually vacates the a7 square to help defend against, you know, c7 entry points. Bishop d6, white takes, queen takes. I mean, maybe even stronger is to keep some tension here with bishop e5. This will be a nuisance as well for black. This sort of position, queen d4, you know, there's uncomfortable pressure here. But bishop takes d6 was played, clarifying the position a bit further. And you might think, well, this is quite simplified. Why does white have a significant advantage here? It's all about the c file and the more aggressive knight here compared to black's knight. The queen has also, you know, the a6 target at the moment. But we see rook a7, queen c2, and a very pleasant position for white. Maybe, you know, rook e3 to c3, or doubling rooks on the e file. So we see black trying to swap off a pair of rooks. And you might think, well, this is surely just simplified. The thing is, now, it's very, very clear white's advantage. Black really hasn't got much counterplay here with this infiltration to the 7th rank. This has been an unfortunate symptom of the opening inaccuracy, which was, b6 exacerbated by bishop d7 after. And then we have here just a clear a position difficult to defend. Black takes on c7, rook takes. So the rook on the 7th. So the knight is actually a bit better than black's knight. The rook is definitely better than the rook. A rook on the 7th is ideal because it cuts off usually the enemy king and has got statistically a lot of targets of attack. We see the move f6 to deprive the knight of e5, but now the knight might have this kind of sequence to at least provoke a weakness like g6, if nothing else. And knight h4 would seem quite a good move, just to reroute the knights here. But this wasn't played. But for example, if g6, g3, and the knight can actually reroute like this to hit d5. This wasn't played. We see king f1, which is a good preparation move for that e file, and then the knight can be thought about moving. But rook f7 challenges the rook. Check. Rook f8. Now here rook c3, keeping the tension in the position. The rook's voluntarily left the 7th rank, which you might think is a really strange decision. But what else? Was he going to carry on checking? Does white still have an advantage here? I believe white does. If we go, for example, with knight d7, let's just see if knight d7 does anything. Knight h4, g6. We can play rook c7 here, and rook f7 isn't such a nuisance. We've got time for g3, and again we're just going to play like this, quietly positionally, and it's very, very difficult to black to get out of this kind of bind. Knight f8, rook c6, and then we're hitting these pawns. We're actually nearly winning a pawn now because the rook has to defend f6. So that just shows the level of discomfort here after rook c3, that even knight d7 is difficult to play here without ultimately losing a pawn and probably the game. We see g5 depriving knight h4, but now knight e1, as though either knight c2 to e3 or just maybe knight d3 to b4 at some point. h5 is played. Aggressive looking. So what's actually black's idea here? If we just rewind that for a moment. Maybe this space king is looking forward to an aggressive pawn in the ending, but at the moment his pieces are quite passive to support this. From an engine perspective, it is one of the best moves actually to play h5. Maybe just trying to cramp white with h4, trying to cramp these pawns over here. But we see now h4 actually being used by white as a temporary pawn sacrifice, and it's quite clever, this h4 here, because if g4, then that's just releasing the f4 square. If g4 here, knight d3, we've got a very juicy f4 square to make use of, hitting d5 and h5. So here, we can just take on h5 simply. So that shows that would be uncomfortable. And taking here, you might think knight f3. No, although knight f3 might seem quite good, I think there's actually technically better here with knight d3, just ignoring the pawns, going for knight f4 soon. If we went for knight f4 here, and we've got a very, very nice position again. Here, we could even take off the rooks, take here, and then go for h5 later. So again, we'll be up as white slightly, but it might not be that greatly significant, but nearly enough to win almost. So knight d3 is quite interesting to go to the f4 square. So black doesn't want to give up f4 basically just yet. He plays knight d7. Possibly this is another slight concession where there might have been what I would call a lesser evil move might have been available here. If king f7, for example, if we go with check, we can use that g6 square. Rook b7 b5. Can this tortuous position really be held? That's an interesting question. I mean, white does have an advantage here, clearly, but maybe it's less painful than the game continuation, which we see with knight d7, because now this rook coming to c7 like this, rook f7. Now we see the move knight f3, prompting the pawn to try and come forward, so we get that f4 square, and in fact black does play g4, so knight e1 now threatens knight d3 to f4. It's pure torture, and you know, stemming from maybe, you know, what you could argue is an opening inaccuracy, then a series of not so best, you know, lesser evil moves in inverted commas, leading to a position here. All the way through though, you know, with this very simplified material position, it's difficult for black to arrange any meaningful counterplay, and the style, the very style of Alexander Alekhine, the rich, complex attacking style, has all been suppressed for this very, very clinical endgame, where he's got these weaknesses now, d5 and h5, and the f4 square is just looking very, very painful. So he tries to get rid of white's use of f4 by playing f5 and f4 himself. But this does leave a permanent target on f4 now. f3 blockading that pawn. Now if g3, let's have a quick look at g3. Knight b4 here is pretty painful. We're going to win one of these pawns, attacking the rook with knight f8, rook c6. These pawns are just like ripe apples waiting to fall off, basically. All of these pawns, unless they're actually going to help the rook in some way. The rook doesn't need to even budge off this c file, so white could just be doing this and winning pawns with his knight potentially. It's just not very, very pleasant at all. So in this position, black played g takes. After g takes a5, we see a4 fixing these pawns now. Black is running out of meaningful moves, really, with this knight kind of virtually pinned, because if knight f6, I think we can just take in and take on f4 is probably good enough for a clear advantage, but even technically stronger is rook c6, just for maximum torture like this. So, okay, we see instead king f8, and now actually rook c6. Possibly better even is b4 though. This is interesting. Well, white's threatening to isolate the pawn, and if takes, then knight takes, and it's difficult to defend d5 again. If knight f6, rook c6. So, but we see actually instead in this position rook c6. So it looks as though rook d6 and also maybe rook h6 in the future might be useful. King e7. And king f2, rook f5, b3. So is black able to hold all his pawns here with the knight and rook? King d8, king e2, knight b8 is played, so offering b6. So you might think, what is this? What's going on here? Offering b6. If rook takes b6, the rook kind of almost a little bit of a trap for the rook after king c7, rook b5, knight c6, and the rook is kind of maybe not ideal as it was. This position with d4 hanging here, so check, and d4's hanging, so black's actually getting back in the game there. No, Botvinnik kept an iron grip on the position here. He didn't take on b6, he played actually rook g6, so trying to keep an iron grip on the position, keeping the knight out of c6, and this knight's ready to use e5 now for the second wave of torture. So this is at move 39, we see rook g6, king c7, knight e5, knight a6, as though b4 might be useful to black, but now check, and here knight c6 immediately threatens knight e7 ending the game, forking, so something has to be done about that. Rook f6. White can now win the d5 pawn though with this check. So what else was there here? I think this is the point where black is forcibly losing material in any case. With that rook again on the 7th, the knight's again better than the counterpart knight, but it's all of black's pawns are just under great scrutiny here compared to white's pawns. So okay, one of them is dropping off now, the d pawn after check. Knight takes d5. And it looks as though, well, at least black's getting this d pawn. It doesn't, not for the moment. Rook g5. After knight b4 putting more pressure on d5. Now knight takes b4 at the cost of doubling the pawns, and now rook takes h5, so we've got past h pawn now, and this is actually quite a horrible endgame position for black. If rook takes d4, then in this position apparently technically best might be rook f5, where white is going to continue with h5. How is black actually going to get access to one of these pawns? It's going to have to waste more time with the rook, and also f4 could drop here, and then b4 under scrutiny. So all of the black pawns are really continually under scrutiny here, like frozen like ice, and just being knocked off. So we see instead rook c6, as though, you know, there's an opportunity to use the b pawn. If this is taken, we've got to pass b pawn, but that is actually subject of removal now after rook b5. King c7, rook takes b4. It's really hopeless now. 3 pawns down for black. Rook h6, rook b5. Okay, 2 pawns down, but the king is now getting to a nice place on e4 potentially. And here black just had enough. He resigned. Now I would like to say, you know, they only played on the record, at least at chessgames.com that I'm aware of, and they only played 3 games against each other. 2 of these games were draws. One of the draws is in this very same tournament, AVRO 1938. The other draw was in 1936, the Nottingham tournament. This was the only decisive encounter between Mikhail Botvinnik and what you could consider as his previous generation elder player, Alekhine. But we see that the importance of the evolution of opening theory, and it doesn't matter how good we are in the middle game, how we've absorbed any lessons of hypermoderns, etc. Here we have a very important position which may have resulted from a number of different opening systems, but it's very important to grip theoretically this position and to ensure that you're not ending up with a slight disadvantage, which can be difficult to recover from. So here it seems technically in this position the most common move is just knight f6, and I think, you know, that concretely raises the playing standards of everyone is continually raised when we learn opening theory and nuances in the opening, so we incur less and less of these disadvantages which we have to end up struggling with. It's a great example game that you know, a small problem in the opening leading to a simplified position where there's not much counterplay and your pawns are actually under more scrutiny all the time, because the opponent's pieces are slightly more active all the time. It's just very, very uncomfortable, even for Alexander Alekhine, to do anything about. Okay, but great credit again, you know, to Mikhail Botvinnik. So in this very same tournament, he also, of course, beat Capablanca brilliantly, which we've seen recently on this channel. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.